Hello guys, welcome back to the Expensive Coins History channel. There's a certain kind of story that hits differently when you're not young anymore. Not loud stories, not fast stories. The kind that slowly creep into your mind and stay there. Stories that make you sit back, look at your hands, and think about everything that has quietly passed through them over the years. Because sometimes, the most unbelievable treasures are not hidden in vaults or buried underground. They pass through your wallet. They jingle in your pocket. They sit in old drawers you haven't opened in decades. And today's story begins with something almost every man watching this has held at some point in life. A simple British 2 Pence coin. The kind that never felt important. The kind you might have tossed into a jar, handed to a child, or ignored at the bottom of a toolbox. Back then, it was just small change. A coin that bought almost nothing. A coin that felt forgettable. But time has a strange way of rewriting value. Because the year is now different. The world is different. And collectors are no longer looking at these coins the way people once did. They're studying them, hunting them, paying shocking amounts for the right ones. And that's where things begin to get interesting. Let's go back to 1975, a year that doesn't feel that long ago to many watching this. A time of hard work, long days, and simpler routines. A time when coins weren't collectibles, they were tools. You earned them, spent them, and moved on. Nobody stopped to admire them. Nobody imagined that one day, those ordinary coins would become silent witnesses to history. In 1975, the British new pence coin was already familiar. Introduced during decimalization, it represented a changing era. A modern Britain stepping away from old systems and moving into a new monetary identity. And on that coin was a face the world instantly recognized. Queen Elizabeth II, calm, composed, timeless. Her portrait wasn't just decoration. It was a symbol of continuity in a rapidly changing world. Millions of these coins were minted. They flooded circulation. They were everywhere. Shops, buses, pub counters, factory lockers. Nobody counted them as special because how could they be? When something is everywhere, it feels permanent. And when something feels permanent, we assume it will always be ordinary. But here's the truth most people didn't understand back then. Mass production doesn't mean mass survival, because coins live hard lives. They fall onto concrete floors. They scrape against keys. They spend years buried in damp drawers. They pass through thousands of hands. And slowly, silently, most of them disappear. Not all at once. Not dramatically. But steadily. A few lost here. A few melted there. A few forgotten in places that time eventually erases. And that's where rarity begins, not in the mint, but in survival. By the time collectors started paying attention decades later, something had changed. The coins were no longer everywhere. The ones that remained were worn, scratched, tired from years of circulation. But every now and then, something unexpected appeared. A coin that somehow escaped the chaos. A coin that didn't live a hard life. A coin that stayed clean, sharp, almost frozen in time. And when one of those coins surfaces, the reaction is immediate. Not excitement at first. Suspicion. Because seasoned collectors know something most people don't. When an everyday object survives in extraordinary condition, it becomes a time capsule. A physical piece of the past that feels untouched. And untouched history carries power. The 1975 new pence coin slowly began gaining attention in collector circles. Not because it was rare in origin, but because pristine survivors were becoming incredibly difficult to find. And the fewer that appeared, the louder the whispers became. Private conversations, quiet auctions, closed-door deals, the kind that don't make headlines but reshape markets. And then something happened that changed how people viewed these coins forever. A sale. Not the kind you see at flea markets. Not a casual trade between hobbyists. A serious transaction. A moment where a collector decided that owning the right 1975 coin was worth far more than anyone outside the hobby could understand. When numbers like that start circulating, the psychology shifts. Suddenly, people stop seeing metal and start seeing opportunity. Men who once ignored coin jars begin opening them again. Old desk drawers become treasure chests. Forgotten tins in garages turn into mysteries waiting to be solved. Because deep down, there's a universal realization that hits hard. If something so small could become valuable once, it could happen again. And that realization is powerful. especially for those who've lived long enough to understand the weight of missed chances. Because most men over 40 don't fear hard work. They don't fear long odds. But they do remember the moments that slipped away, the investments they didn't make, the items they sold too early, the things they once owned that later became valuable. That's why stories like this resonate so deeply. They're not just about coins. They're about time. The 1975 new Pence coin became more than currency. It became a symbol of how quietly value can grow while life moves forward. How something ignored for decades can suddenly return with unexpected significance. And how history doesn't always announce itself when it passes through your hands. But here's where it gets even more compelling. Because not every valuable coin reveals itself immediately. Some take years before the market truly wakes up. Years before collectors connect the dots. Years before the right examples surface and redefine what people thought they knew. And when that awakening happens, it rarely stays contained. Collectors talk. Dealers notice. Markets react. And the ripple effect spreads far beyond the hobby itself. Men who haven't thought about coins in decades start remembering. The weight of pocket change. The sound of metal hitting wooden counters. The quiet rituals of everyday life that once felt insignificant but now feel strangely meaningful. Because memory has a way of attaching itself to objects. And few objects carry memory like coins. They travel with us through time. Through youth, through struggle, through progress. They witness chapters of life we rarely revisit. And when one of those coins resurfaces with new value, it doesn't just shock the market. It unlocks something emotional, a connection between past and present. The 1975 new Pence coin is one of those objects. A reminder that history doesn't disappear. It waits, sometimes for decades, waiting for the right moment to be rediscovered. And as collectors began realizing this, something else became clear: 1975 wasn't alone. Because once you start looking closely at a single year, patterns begin to emerge. Other dates, other coins, other silent survivors hiding in plain sight. And that realization opens a door most people never even knew existed. A door that leads deeper into a world where ordinary objects quietly transform into extraordinary assets. A world where patience beats speed, where awareness beats luck, and where the past can suddenly become very, very valuable. And just when it feels like the story might end there, it doesn't. Because another year steps into the spotlight. Another coin, another chapter, another quiet piece of history waiting to be understood in a completely different way. And what happened next would surprise even seasoned collectors. Because by the time attention began shifting toward the late 1970s, something unusual was happening in the collector world. Not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. A growing awareness that certain everyday coins from that era were behaving differently than expected. Not in circulation, but in survival, in condition, in the quiet math of scarcity that only becomes visible decades later. And that brings us to 1978. For many men watching this, 1978 doesn't feel distant. It feels familiar. A year tied to memories that are still clear. Work routines, radio stations, even the smell of shops and streets from that time. Life moved slower, but responsibilities felt heavier. You earned what you had. You spent what you needed. And coins? They were just part of the rhythm. Tools of daily life. Nothing more. The two new Pence coin of 1978 looked almost identical to the ones that came before it. Same size, same tone, same unmistakable portrait of Queen Elizabeth II, steady as ever, representing continuity in a world constantly shifting beneath people's feet. To the average person, it was just another coin among thousands. Familiar, predictable, easy to ignore. But here's the thing about history. Sameness is often an illusion. Because even when coins look identical, time treats them differently. Some are spent endlessly. Some are lost quickly. Some are damaged early. And a very small number take a different path entirely. A path shaped by accident, circumstance, or pure chance. A coin tucked into a drawer and forgotten. A coin saved in a jar that was never opened again. A coin placed somewhere safe and simply left alone. And over decades, those small differences create massive outcomes. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the coin collecting landscape had changed. The hobby wasn't just about nostalgia anymore. It had matured. Serious collectors began applying sharper analysis. They weren't just asking which coins existed. They were asking which coins survived well. And survival in high condition is where rarity truly begins. Because when collectors started examining surviving 1978 new Pence coins closely, a pattern started forming. Plenty of worn examples existed as expected, but finding one that looked untouched, sharp edges, clean surfaces, full original detail was a completely different challenge. And challenges create demand. Not overnight, not in explosive headlines, but slowly, quietly, the way real markets often move before the public notices. Conversations began happening behind the scenes. Collectors comparing notes, dealers sharing observations, private buyers asking very specific questions. Not about any 1978 coin, but about the right one, the preserved one, the survivor that somehow escaped decades of damage. And once a few people begin asking those kinds of questions, something shifts. Because serious collectors are pattern readers, they watch behavior, they track scarcity. And when multiple experienced buyers begin focusing on the same overlooked item, it sends a signal through the collecting world, a signal that something is changing. At first, most people ignored it. That's usually how these stories begin. The early signs rarely look dramatic. A slightly higher auction result here, a quiet private sale there. Numbers that don't make sense to outsiders but speak volumes to those paying attention. And then comes the moment that changes perception. Not a loud announcement, not a viral headline, just a result, a number, a transaction that feels different. Because when a coin people once treated as pocket change suddenly commands serious money, it forces a psychological shift. It breaks assumptions. It challenges decades of thinking. It makes people pause. And once people pause, curiosity takes over. Men who haven't thought about coins since childhood start remembering where they last saw one. Old collections get revisited. Forgotten containers get reopened. Because the realization spreads fast. If something so ordinary could become valuable without anyone noticing, how many other things have been hiding in plain sight? That question is powerful, especially for those who understand the value of experience. Because by the time someone reaches their 40s, 50s, or 60s, they've seen enough of life to know that value rarely shouts. It builds quietly, slowly, in the background while people are busy living. The 1978 new Pence coin became one of those quiet builders. Not flashy, not famous, but increasingly respected among those who understood what they were looking at. A coin that represented something deeper than metal, the idea that survival itself creates rarity, that time filters everything, and that only a few objects make it through decades unchanged. And when that idea takes hold, it reshapes behavior. Collectors become more patient, more observant, less interested in quantity and more focused on quality. Because they realize something fundamental, not every old coin becomes valuable. But the right old coin, preserved the right way, can rewrite expectations entirely. And that realization spreads beyond collecting. It touches something universal. Because deep down, everyone understands the concept of overlooked value. The house someone almost bought, the car they sold too early, the small decisions that later feel bigger in hindsight. Life is full of those moments. Quiet crossroads that only reveal their importance years later. That's why stories like this resonate so strongly. They mirror life itself. The 1978 new Pence coin isn't just a collectible. It's a symbol of delayed recognition. A reminder that importance isn't always visible in real time. That sometimes the world only understands value after enough years have passed for perspective to settle in. And once that understanding spreads, it creates momentum. Not hype, not noise, but steady attention. And attention is the fuel that drives collector markets. Because markets aren't built on metal. They're built on belief. Shared belief that certain objects matter more than they once did. And once enough people share that belief, reality begins to follow. Prices shift. Interest grows. Stories spread. And with every new conversation, the past becomes more alive. Men who once carried these coins without thinking now see them differently. Not as money, but as artifacts. small witnesses to earlier chapters of their lives, pieces of a timeline they've personally lived through. And that personal connection adds weight. Because value isn't always financial. Sometimes it's emotional first. A bridge between who you were and who you've become. And when an object carries both emotional and financial significance, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes unforgettable. The 1978 new Pence coin reached that point quietly. No grand announcement. No sudden explosión. Just a steady climb in recognition among those who understood its story. A growing respect for something once dismissed as ordinary. And as that respect grew, something else happened. Collectors started looking even closer at the surrounding years. Because patterns rarely exist in isolation. When one overlooked coin begins gaining attention, it naturally raises a question: what else from that era has been underestimated? What other silent survivors are still waiting to be recognized? And that question opens the door to the final chapter of this story. A chapter that feels even more personal. Even more surprising. Because sometimes the most powerful realizations don't come from the first discovery or the second. They come from the moment when everything connects. When separate pieces suddenly form a bigger picture. And in this case, that bigger picture leads us to one more coin. One more year. One more quiet traveler through time that most people never gave a second thought. Until now. And now we arrive at 1979. For many men watching this, that year carries weight. It wasn't just another number on a calendar. It was the edge of a new decade. Turning point. Economies shifting. Industries evolving. Families growing. Responsibilities deepening. The world felt like it was preparing for something bigger. And in the middle of all that movement, the two new Pence coin of 1979 quietly entered circulation. No celebration. No spotlight. Just another batch of freshly struck coins released into everyday life. Same familiar size. Same unmistakable portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. Same copper tone that blended into pockets and tills across Britain. To the average person, it was nothing. To time, it was everything. Because 1979 carried a different energy. It marked the close of a chapter. The end of the 70s. And coins struck at the end of eras often carry a subtle psychological weight that only becomes clear years later. They represent conclusions. Final notes before transitions. But again, nobody knew that then. Coins were spent the same way they always had been. Thrown into change trays. Used for bus fares. Dropped into pub counters. Slid across shop desks. They lived fast and rough lives. And like all circulating coins, most of them wore down quickly. Yet, just like 1975, just like 1978, a few didn't. A few escaped. A few avoided the scrapes, the deep scratches, the dulling of detail that time usually guarantees. Maybe they were set aside intentionally. Maybe forgotten in a box during a house move. Maybe saved by someone who simply liked the shine of a new coin and decided not to spend it. Whatever the reason, a tiny fraction survived in extraordinary condition. And survival is where the story transforms. By why the time collectors began looking back at the late 70s with sharper eyes, something fascinating became clear. The number of high-quality 1979 new Pence coins available was dramatically smaller than most assumed. Not because they weren't minted in strong numbers, but because life had filtered them out. And filtering changes everything. Because when supply shrinks quietly over decades, demand doesn't need to explode to create impact. It only needs to grow steadily, methodically, patiently. And that's exactly what happened. Serious collectors started recognizing that the late 70s coins, especially well-preserved examples, represented more than spare change. They were survivors of a specific era. The final years before the 1980s reshaped Britain in economic and cultural ways that are still discussed today. Owning one wasn't just about metal. It was about owning a preserved piece of transition. And transition carries weight. Men who lived through those years understand that feeling. The sense that something was ending while something new was beginning. The awareness that change doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it just quietly replaces what came before. The 1979 coin captured that moment. And when collectors began placing higher importance on coins that symbolized transitions, the market started responding. Again, not dramatically at first. Just a few surprising sales, a few raised eyebrows, a few conversations that began with, "That can't be right," and ended with, Maybe we've been underestimating this. Because underestimation is the common thread in all three of these coins. 1975 was underestimated because it felt too common. 1978 was underestimated because it looked identical to countless others. 1979 was underestimated because it marked an ending people didn't realize mattered. But time corrects underestimation. And when time corrects something, the adjustment can be powerful. The real turning point came when the right 1979 coin, preserved, authenticated, nearly untouched, crossed the market in a serious transaction, the kind of sale that doesn't just surprise collectors, but forces a recalculation. Because numbers speak loudly when they're real. And when a coin once dismissed as pocket change begins commanding serious five-figure, even six-figure attention among private buyers, it forces the broader market to wake up. That's when the psychology shifts completely. Men who once ignored these coins begin seeing them differently. Not as currency, but as assets. Not as leftovers from the past, but as potential bridges to financial opportunity. And here's the deeper truth that makes this story powerful. These coins were never rare in the beginning. They became rare because most people didn't think they were important. That's how value is often born, through decades of indifference. And that realization hits differently for men over 40. Because by that stage in life, you've learned that patience matters. That overlooked opportunities sometimes age better than obvious ones. That what seems small today can quietly grow while everyone else is distracted. The 1975, 1978, and 1979 new Pence coins embody that lesson perfectly. They remind us that value doesn't always announce itself at the start. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it matures in silence. Sometimes it requires decades before the world fully understands what survived. And now, after all these years, the numbers attached to these coins tell a story that's impossible to ignore. The right 1975 new Pence coin has reached values around $129,000. The right 1978 new Pence coin has reached values around $102,000. And the right 1979 new Pence coin has reached values around $94,000. Let that settle in for a moment. Coins that once bought almost nothing. Coins that passed through ordinary hands. Coins that many people wouldn't bend down to pick up today. Now carrying six-figure potential under the right circumstances. That's not hype. That's the power of time, survival, and changing perception. And here's the final thought that matters most. Not every new Pence coin from those years is worth that kind of money. Condition matters. Preservation matters. Authentication matters. The market rewards the exceptional, not the average. But the existence of those numbers changes something important. It proves that ordinary objects can transform. It proves that history hides in plain sight. It proves that sometimes, the things we overlook carry the greatest long-term potential. And maybe, just maybe, it's worth taking a second look at what's been sitting quietly in drawers, jars, and old collections for decades. Because every great collecting story begins the same way. With something small. Something ignored. Something that waited patiently for the world to notice. And sometimes, when the world finally does notice, the results are life-changing.